Hello, everyone. Welcome to MVP Tech Bytes. Today we have Betim. Betim, you're from Albania, right?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
from Albania and I'm the first Microsoft MVP from Albania. So in these 30 years of the program, basically, I'm the first one. I've been renewed for a second year and I'm mainly focused in business applications in on the developer side more than I've also organized conferences and trainings, but I have at heart developers mainly, right? So my focus is trying to create tools and to write blog posts that help the developers deliver easier.
Great. Thank you so much for all the hard work that you do. And it's community too. It's like you sharing your information. Now, today, if I'm correct, you actually expertise in Power Platform. And you wanted to talk about Power Platform and how to extend components of it. And I believe you have even a GitHub repository that has a lot of these mocking and like component framework of how you could use within Power Apps.
Yes. So basically, today's focus will be on the code components for the Power Platform.
Mhm.
They call them PCF components. The reason why I love the Power Platform basically is that it allows anyone to create solutions for business problems. It allows people with low technical expertise used to be called citizen developers or
Mhm.
low code developers to deliver solutions. It allows professional developers to also deliver solutions. Obviously, the focus is mainly on low code development, but professional developers mainly help the low code developers to deliver quicker and to deliver well tested solutions. Now,
Great.
the idea we are going to talk about the code um, code components for
Mhm.
the Power Platform. Obviously, those are for a professional developer, and we are using Studio Code to create one. There are lots of tutorials how to easily start and create a component. I will like to share basically one example of these code components. It's one from the community. It's not even my own component.
Okay.
So it's called colorful option set, for example. And
Okay.
I won't go over the code at the moment, but what I would like to show is how how do we run these components. So
Mhm.
we will be executing npm run start, and the PCF uh, will be executing and starts the test harness, which is the development or testing environment that Microsoft gives us for these components.
Okay.
Now, this is a little bit tricky because it doesn't save all the values every time, and it's not responsive enough. So I changed the value here, but I didn't set new value. Now that I refresh the components, I can see the new
Okay.
value, even though it hasn't loaded that CCS, for example, that the component has imported. So it's not rendering in the perfect way.
Okay.
So there are better ways, basically. Since I mentioned I like to help developers with confidence and deliver quickly.
Mhm.
I built this component framework mock. So I've mocked the whole API of the component framework that we get from Microsoft,
Okay.
and I've created some ways to integrate that into Storybook. Storybook is another well written and very helpful product to basically build the components. So Storybook helps you with an environment
Okay.
uh, to configure your use cases and your components for edge cases, for example, which is really important, and it's something that you don't get with harness.
So
Um,
what's the difference between Storybook and like Test Harness? Isn't
so the
Test Harness enough for people to use?
Yeah, the idea is that test harness is pretty limited. For example, you don't get the web API implemented. So if your component tries to use the web API, then in the test harness, you will get a not implemented exception.
Okay.
And with a component framework mock that I've built, you can basically use your component even with the web API, and it
Okay.
actually has an in-memory database, so it's actually executing queries. You will be able to test your select, update, create query that you have on your component. It will be actually executing in SQL, in JavaScript, in memory.
Okay. Cool. So I
You
also
can
know that you have a GitHub repository too, right? So I wanted to share this right here too, and you have all your code components in there too.
Yes, so the repository of
Mm.
GitHub, basically the main one for this is called Component Framework Mock. I have
Okay.
published it under my company, basically, Online. Um, if you go there, you will see there are lots of stories written so that you can see these as examples, or if you want to see how the component framework mock helps you write tests without focusing on the API itself, but focusing on your component. So you
Mm.
will be able to set up, for example, this is testing the API, for example.
Okay.
Uh, you will be able to set up your tests in a simple way. So you are just telling it, this is my component, this is the value it has, it's of type lookup, and I want to use the web API. So
Okay.
you will be actually executing from the web API a retrieve record, and there is nothing in here in the tests. So the end user doesn't need to tell the framework how the web API works, right?
Okay.
So they will be testing, I just want to retrieve a record with this ID, and in the setup, basically it should have the data already set up in here, init metadata. We are describing our database, and then init items is initializing our database with records.
Okay.
And we are just doing retrieve record in the same way as you would be doing from your component in this test.
Okay. Mm.
Same way for, there are lots of different tests here. For example, delete, create a record with that ID, or there are lots of samples to be inspired from, right?
Okay.
As I mentioned, the beauty of this is uh, we want to use Storybook to go in and to do a collaborative session, let's say, or development with all the stakeholders project.
Mm.
If we
Yeah.
wanted, if we stayed in the test harness, then only a developer can do that npm run start and understand the harness. The alternative is publishing in a URL which is internal or public, depending on the intellectual property, let's say.
Okay.
Uh, for for this component framework mock, we have published in the Chromatic service, which are the creators of Storybook, basically.
Okay.
And this is free for all, where you can see you have some description and you can play with your controls. Now, the controls that I published for component framework mock here are pretty simple because I didn't want to focus much on complexities of different controls, but I wanted to test different things. For example, this complex control has an output only property. So every
Okay.
time you change the input property, it's triggering, it's telling you that your output only property has these values.
Okay.
Pretty simple, but it's just for people to go and see the code, how things have been set up.
So in some ways, if I'm clear on this, it's basically, let's say you have a business holder and they're trying to have a Power App application that teaches, for example, just courses, and you want to showcase them a bunch of courses and how people would register. You could use this storyboard and say that they might say that actually I need them to choose, I don't know, checkboxes here or drop down here and stuff, and you could work with them together and build this whole kind of a UI with them without
Yes.
having it to run it on your local computer. You could publish automatically on the URL sort of thing. And you could
Yeah. Now,
collaborate.
since we are talking about business applications and power
Yeah.
apps, the way to run these applications basically is with a power app. So
Yeah.
you'll be running it in the platform. With this component framework mock, you can actually take pieces of your solution, so the custom components, you can showcase them outside of the platform. So it is easy, it doesn't need a license, for example, for the
Okay.
people to test and play with components. And the most important part is the edge cases. For example, if I have a lookup,
Mhm.
or if I have a list of a list component,
Yeah.
and then I need to show how the list behaves when it has no records, when it has 10 records, and when
Mhm.
it has, for example, uh, 1,000 records.
Yeah.
And if I need to show that in the platform, basically either I need to find some way of filtering the results easily, or it's going to be almost impossible. It's going to always ask for interaction from the user to go to that specific case. With Storybook, you can configure uh, different stories. So this is disabled, and this is enabled. This is with a fixed height. Now the colors work here in the switches.
Okay.
Switches, it's disabled or fixed height, or this is with two different columns.
Mhm.
Uh, this is not working for this, but it should be working for the checkboxes. And
Okay.
these kind of errors, let's say, uh, basically I've left them intentionally there because I need to show people the benefits of using Storybook, right? Because someone can go and play with all these combinations and check, for example, that the orientation for this doesn't render beautifully, right?
Yeah.
I can't read what's written there. So they can file a bug, they can copy the link to this specific renderization, or they can start playing a little bit with colors or stuff like that.
Mhm.
And it will generate a URL with that configuration of the parameters. And then you can take that URL and open it like this, and whoever needs to, or the developer, for example, can
Mhm.
have the same parameters configured and the same view rendered, and they
Mhm.
can start to debug what's going on with the component. Why isn't it behaving as it was expected? Or they can see there was some edge case that was missed.
So there's also such a thing as a virtual component. What is a virtual component?
Yeah, so there are two kinds of components basically in the code components. There are the
Mhm.
standard ones where you can use your own framework. So it can be plain HTML and JavaScript, or it can be React.js or
Okay.
Angular, whatever framework you want to use, you can use it because you get from the framework, you get a div component, a div element, and then you can render with whatever technology you like in there. The downside of that is that you need to bundle all your JavaScript and all your Angular for every component every time. So the bundle
Okay.
size is really big.
Okay.
The improvement is using virtual components, which basically are React components and are using the framework's React
Mhm.
engine, let's say.
Yeah.
So it is fixed with the version. And the benefits of that are very lightweight components because the bundle is really small. It's only the definition component. It doesn't have the framework attached.
Okay. Mhm.
You can use Fluent UI also with that from the framework. The tricky part is that you cannot test them properly with TestBytes, for example,
Okay.
or and you can obviously test them with the component framework mock and with Storybook. The only difference is that you need to do some configuration in the Storybook main TS file
Hmm.
just for the framework to use the right version of React,
Okay.
and that's it. Everything else is already covered. So we were
So,
seeing here in the components, for example, this
mhm.
is showing the size of the container,
Okay.
and this is a standard component. This is a React component that is doing the same.
Okay. But how do you manage these virtual components then? Is there a way to manage them?
The idea is when you publish them in the uh, environment,
Yeah.
those are pretty much similar.
Okay.
So the maker can use them without knowing if it is a React component or if it is a standard component. So
Okay.
virtual or standard doesn't matter for the maker, right? For the user.
Mhm.
It is important for the developer, the professional developer that is creating that component because they will be concerned a lot more about the uh, performance of these components. So, for
Okay.
example, if I open the DevTools, I
Mhm.
can see what is happening with my component when the update view is being whatever I have put there as a console log, for example, or I can
Yeah.
see the actual code of these components. So if I go in here, I can see the TypeScript code and I can go and walk through basically
Okay.
the code. I can do the same thing in a test environment, right? If I have Jest, for example, doing some unit testing with this component framework mock, you can basically go inside your component and you have a mocked basically API, but you have the PCF component framework API in your component. So you can basically work through the code and find the edge cases, but
Mhm.
by checking the values in your code. So
Okay.
it's one of the benefits of unit testing, right? You can test locally.
Yeah.
Now I have basically done one which took me like a working day, 8 hours to develop,
Okay.
and I have published this in the environment only once. So only at the end of the day, I published it in the environment. No, it was something else, but I need to update this. So this component is not, it is a simple component. It's just an audio player. The
Okay.
use case for this was a call center, which had phone call registrations that they needed, recordings that they needed to play back easily. We did this component that was integrated in the dynamics form.
Mhm.
And when they were seeing the phone call, they could also hear the recording easily.
Okay.
Now, to this is pure HTML. I usually, every time that I create a component, I try to put something particular in it. So I try to find the challenge and try to overcome that challenge and do the component at the same time. So
Okay.
the challenge for this was to create the component in plain JavaScript HTML without any framework so that it could be lightweight, because it was an audio player where the bandwidth should be used by the audio file and not by your component, basically. That
True,
was
true. Yeah. So, do you have a complex one that you could showcase, like that actually showcase how these multiple components could be on one page, as an
we
example?
we have so the multiple components on a page. I haven't put that as a demo yet because there is
Okay.
one part that I would like to implement still in the component framework mock, which is integrating these multiple components with the same state in a sense, so that
Okay.
it's the same way as you would get in a form or in a screen in Canvas app.
Mhm.
Currently, these are, even if you put them in the same, let's say, in the same story,
Mhm.
these are disconnected from each other, right?
Okay.
One of the improvements that I would like to do, but it's a little bit challenging because of the way I've set up until now the component framework mock, is that to make it possible to integrate two or more components in the same state. So if I have the same parameter basically bound to two components, it will
Yeah.
trigger the update view for both.
Okay.
Complicated, let's say, part is the Parquet code components, which is the creator kit
Okay.
uh, done by the Parquet team in Microsoft. Basically, we have done not everything, but we have done most of the components with Storybook. So
Mhm.
you can see them in here. The way that Microsoft is showcasing these is components. So you get a reference app where these components have been configured in the environment. Obviously, that is interesting because you are exactly seeing uh, how the component will render in your environment. These
Mhm.
are a little bit more isolated because you are not seeing them in a dynamics environment. You are seeing them outside
Yeah.
in a mocked environment. But basically, I can do something that you cannot do. So the calendar, for example, which has all these parameters. Uh, One thing, for example, that it's hard to find when you are using it inside the uh, environment and not with Storybook are bugs, for example, like this. The Italian language
Mhm.
translation doesn't render very well because it has some problems, some issues.
Yeah.
And if you want to file a bug with Microsoft the normal way, it would be you'll take a screenshot and they will ask you how to replicate the same error, and
Mhm.
it's going to take a lot of time back and forth with Microsoft support to explain how to replicate the issue, even though
Yeah.
it's easy, right? It's just
Yeah.
Italian language translations are not rendering well. If you do it like this, you can just copy this link and share the link, and you'll tell them these are the parameters, it's not rendering well, and you can basically uh, test all the languages very easily. There are
Mhm.
lots of translations that have been missed for these components,
Okay.
but this is one complicated component which has lots of input parameters that basically we've written a story without too much complications. We left all the parameters here generic so
Okay.
people can play around with them. But when you want to show the edge cases, for example, like this is the breadcrumb component. If you don't specify any items, it triggers something which is this uh, placeholders, let's say item 1, 2, and 3.
Okay. So, as a developer, if I wanted to extend these, how do I do that?
So you can write stories.
Okay.
Uh, the idea is this is the audio player, the one that I was telling about that I've developed in 8 hours.
Okay.
Uh, you and set up everything. I have published recently a blog post how to set up these stories and how to write the stories. As example, I've taken exactly the audio player, so people can see the see the blog post and compare basically what I've described there.
Okay.
Uh, it is pretty much easy. The most important part here is this render generator, which is sort of a template how to generate, how to render your component in the story. And it's basically setting up the component framework mock generator, which is the basically the controller or the it's substituting the environment basically, and it's the thing that we use to configure our database.
Okay.
The component framework mock has been set up in a way that it's uh, as as much auto config as possible, right?
Okay.
So it only needs the configurations that are strictly necessary. For example, when you are creating it, you need to tell it this is the component that I'm testing, basically, or rendering. Component here, I have this habit of renaming the whatever the class name is to component so that when I see the render, it is always component, so I know it's part of the template. It needs to specify which types the inputs are. This is important because Microsoft has given us the interfaces in TypeScript for describing the inputs and outputs. But when we are executing code in Storybook, we need some objects to act upon, right? We cannot
Yes.
execute an interface. So I've created this way of telling it for each parameter which mock type it is. So if it is a string parameter, it needs a string property mock, and so on and so forth. Even for data sets, which are complicated. Then you just do the initialization. You tell it this is the starting point with this set canvas items. You are just setting the initial value of the items. You can mock everything because we we have every object in the framework is mocked, and you
Yeah.
can change the behavior. So
Okay.
if there is something you want to do differently, then you can act on it, like because it's a mock, you can say calls fake, for example. So instead of doing whatever I have told it to do for how to mock from the official API, you might want to do something simpler, or you might want to inject something of your own. So you will be doing this.
Okay.
For example, I've done this on output change. This is not part of the framework. It's just to have a connection point with the framework uh, for when the component is calling notify output change. Then you can update Storybook parameters. So this way, when I update the parameters from the component, not from Storybook, I keep them in sync basically. So even
Okay.
the Storybook parameters will be showing the latest value.
So I know that this is JavaScript sort of thing. Does it actually support any other languages?
So the support is JavaScript or TypeScript, right?
Okay.
Um, because these are code components that are running
Yeah.
on the front end.
Yeah. So that's why in some ways you could actually use this or even a React where you could actually intermix these kinds of component. Now,
Yes,
I'm just thinking out loud. Like I know that there are some Blazor developers. Does Blazor fit into here by any chance, or it's like totally out of the
I
ecosystem?
I think it's slightly out for the moment. Now
Okay.
I have built components that are WebAssembly under the hood for some of the actions, let's say.
Okay.
But I haven't built the Blazor code or the WebAssembly code. It was from some third party,
Okay.
but I have integrated, let's say, components that are consuming the WebAssembly uh, code.
Cool. So, what would be a call for actions for our viewers today?
Obviously, this is an open source
Mhm.
component. So first thing is go to the repository and uh, you can contribute by opening issues or by using the component. Even that is a contribution because uh, if you are using the component, then you will find what's still missing and you will be forced to ask for improvements.
Sure.
We do love feature requests. So
Mhm.
that would be my call to action, right?
Great.
Go
I'll
to the
share the
repository and
I'll share the repo down in our link show notes too.
yeah.
Do you have a blog post too that you want to share?
Yes, so there is a blog post that I published recently, and
Okay.
it's showing how to set up these stories. Uh,
Okay.
it takes an example, the audio player that I'm showing right now in the
Yep.
video.
Mhm.
Uh, Obviously, I publish lots of blog posts which
Yep.
are mainly developer focused.
Mhm.
It's not only PCF focused, like the previous one was uh, for the pipelines, basically, how to
Okay.
set up the pack CLI in the pipelines.
Mhm.
Uh, so I have different kinds of posts, like Unified Service Desk, which is almost a dinosaur at the moment, but still, even for that, I've published a blog post. Yeah.
So I'll share those. I'll share your blog post inside the show note. So thank you so much, Betim. I learned quite a lot about PCF components and storyboards. I didn't even know it existed as a C sharp developer myself, and I know React and all that stuff, but I didn't know that actually could use all of this stuff within Power Platform even. So
You
thank you
can
so much. Mhm.
you can basically use that kind of stuff only because I've created the component framework mock, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, there was a missing link
Yeah,
to get the best of the both worlds.
great. Thank you so much for your open source work and everything. It was great speaking to you. So I'll
It
speak to you
was
next time, maybe.
yeah. Thank you
Take
very
care.
much. It was